All right, Miss Huggins.
Yes. Well, I think my background includes having an early retirement from US West, which enabled me to go and work for 3.5 years at Catholic Charities, a job that I loved, as an employment counselor. And I ended my working years as administrator at Carlson School in the Office of Information Technology. I'm 79 years old. I'll be 80 in May. And I grew up on 36th and 4th Avenue and across the street from Hosmer Library. I went to the neighborhood schools. We could walk to the schools. It was, I think it was a charmed childhood, actually, because we had everything that we needed right there in that neighborhood. And my experience, I lived there from the time I was 18 months old until I was 21. And when I was 21, I moved to California. And I think the thing that strikes me is that my history is a bit different from Anthony's and perhaps from Louis, because they stayed here. I left here in 1963 as they were, I will put it this way, in the process of putting in 35W. And I came back in 78, pardon me. And my perspective is that it was like a before and after, because as I was leaving, my neighborhood was changing, but it seemed to be intact. When I came back in 78, it was like a shock to see what had happened. My parents stayed there. After I left, they had bought the house in 1943, and they moved in 1968 because the neighborhood had just changed so much. When I was growing up, and I will specify that my neighborhood was integrated. We had white neighbors, we had Jewish neighbors, we had, there was one family that had moved in who were Japanese, who had recently been relocated from, the camps that they had moved the Japanese citizens to. And it was just, we all flowed. I had white friends. I think there were 2 or 3 people who had actually come in from on the Cuban Mario movement. They had actually moved in. So I had friends from all nations, actually. And it was a rich experience. The businesses, I think Anthony mentioned 38th and 4th Avenue. I mean, that was a vital hub. Even when I was a small child, there was a restaurant up there on 38th and 4th. That's where the Spokesman Recorder, they opened their offices there. I remember the Schofield family later on, perhaps in probably the late 50s, they opened up a grocery store, and what now I realize was a deli right there at 38th in Chicago, where the mosque is right now, or 38th and 4th, where the mosque is. It was just a rich, wonderful, safe community. And coming back, one of the reasons I moved back from San Francisco was because in my mind, it was still the same place that I had left. And I was just shocked to see what had happened. It had turned into just a skeleton of what had been there before. And and I ended up, really kind of shocked at what I found. And I think I even went through a period of depression, like, why did I come back to this? Because it had changed so tremendously. It was no longer a warm, inviting place. It was separated. Even the park, Nicollet Park, you know, they cut through a portion of that. It was grieving for me to see what had happened.
35W cut through a part of that, what you mean, right?
Pardon?
35W cut through a part
Yes.
of it. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
But that's my history, and that's my perspective of what I've seen.
Thank you, Ms. Huggins.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Moore. Can you introduce yourself and
Your mic is off.
Mr. Moore, oh, I think you need to unmute.
Yes, my daughter put me on mute. Yeah, I'm Louis Moore, and in recent years, I'm a retiree from the United States House of Representatives. I worked for Congressman Martin Sable for 19 years. I have been retired for almost 15 years now, and I pretty much enjoyed the opportunity to be retired. I'm currently president of the Major Taylor Bicycling Club of Minnesota, so I'm one of those crazy guys you see out there in Lycra on a bicycle flying down the road with probably 10 other guys. But that's been my retirement, and it's been a good experience because it's enabled me to stay physically fit, but it's also enabled me to meet a lot of people around the country and enjoy the opportunity of cycling with a lot of different folks in different states. When I lived in the neighborhood, we lived at 4320 3rd Avenue South. Across the street was a big empty lot. Right now, there are townhouses. But there were only 2 Black families on the block. The other family on the block was a gentleman named Glenn Pullins, who was a super duper car salesman at Grossman Chevrolet on Lake Street. So he was making oodles of money, I guess. We were in a block of houses that were ramblers. So I think they were probably part of the newest housing in Minneapolis at the time. They kind of looked like suburban housing. And it was kind of interesting because most of the friends that I had while I was living on that block were white, because obviously the rest of the population on the block was white. One of my best friends lived on the corner. He and I went to last year of grade school and junior high school together. And then he moved to the suburbs. I remember a lot of things about the community, basically that it was a neighborhood, it was a real neighborhood. Prior to coming to Minneapolis, we had lived in St. Paul. And that was, you know, about the time when they were beginning to talk about cutting through Rondo to build 94. And as a youth, I had no inkling of what that was going to be or what that was about. But when we moved to Minneapolis and we started hearing about 35W, then things kind of clicked because I was like 13, 14 years old. I had a lot of friends on the other side of what is 35W now. And so, you know, we would go back and forth, play on sports teams together at Nicollet Park.
Yeah.
So we had a pretty good community. Never really had much of any problems that I can remember. I remember having a neighbor that lived across the alley who kept, you know, he asked me my name one day and I said, my name is Louis, and he couldn't seem to say Louis, but he could say Willie. And I found out that he was a baseball fanatic, and he, you know, when he saw me, he saw Willie Mays. So every time I was out in the yard or we had any kind of communication, with, hey, Willie, how you doing? And after a while, you know, as a kid, I just let it go. I didn't make a big deal of it. But that was just, I was probably the only shall I say, the only person that he really had any contact, only person of color he really had any contact with. But it was a real neighborhood, and there were a lot of folks that lived further north that I was friends with that, spent a lot of time at their houses. A lot of people down around where Nelda lived were friends. But it was a real community at that time. I mean, it was a lot of fun. I'll put it that way. And went to Bryan Junior High School, went to Minneapolis Central, and those were good times. I'll stop at that point.
Thank you. My next question dealing with Black churches and businesses in the South Side. This would be for you, Ms. Huggins. Black churches have always been and still today play an important role for Black people. Were there churches located on the South Side of Minneapolis? And if so, identify them. And secondly, if you will, please, were they impacted by 35W before and after the freeway? And also along that same line, what about Black businesses? What businesses were located there on the South Side? And were they impacted?
Well,
You can take them in the order you want.
as far as the churches, it stands out in my mind, St. Peter's AME. I believe they had originally had a church down around 24th Street, and I don't remember what the cross street was. But I think that there'd been a fire or something of the sort, and they decided to build on 41st and 4th Avenue. And it was quite it was big news when they moved. In fact, they had a major opening. There were other churches there as well. There were several small congregations on 4th Avenue that I recall. I don't remember the names of them. I think one was a Baptist church. I think another one was a Pentecostal church. Another major thing that happened was when Martin Luther King, when Stanley R. King decided to move Sabathany. At that time, it was called Sabathany, to move it to an empty building that had been a church, but it was no longer in use. And it was on, I believe, 3rd Avenue and 38th Street. And that was, again, another major thing that had happened. I recall that eventually, that congregation split and took over an insurance building that was further east, maybe a block or two east on 38th Street. As far as the churches were concerned, I don't know what kind of an impact it may have had. 35W on the church community itself. It may have made it a little bit difficult to get there. However, we did have the link of 38th Street that could get people moving from one side of the community to the other and to get to the churches. The business community I mentioned before, 38th and 4th Avenue was just a really vital place to live and to work, to shop. There had always been businesses there. There had always been beauty salons there. There had always been barber shops there. I recall when I was a child, down on 35th and 4th, there actually had been a drugstore that was there that had sometime before the building of the freeway had closed and the owner, I think, had retired. As far as the changes in the business community, I can recall that I worked at the Red Owl store, which was at 39th and Nicollet. You could walk there. You could shop there. There were also grocery stores that were over on 37th and Chicago, right down the street from where I live now. And you could go to these places, you could do business, and it was in the community. And anything that you needed was in the community. You know, we didn't have big box stores or anything like that, because anything that you wanted was right there. And as far as the changes are concerned, as I said earlier, when I came back, I would go looking for these connections. I'd be looking for these shops. I would be looking for the people that I used to engage with. And everything had just changed. You know, one of the things that I recall as it was sort of like a strong place, like an anchor, was the spokesman recorder office. You know, in fact, it's still there. And that meant, you know, that was really had a very strong influence on the entire community, well, both St. Paul and Minneapolis, because it linked us together. And we had the news, we had what was going on in the community, we had what was going on in the churches, we had what was happening as far as social life is concerned. And, you know, and that's still thriving. So, you know, that's my recollection of what it was like then. And with that, others.
Scott.
Well, yeah, as far as the churches, we attended a church, Bethesda Baptist Church, 1118 8th Street South. The church is still there. My mother was the choir director and pianist. My grandmother sang in the choir. My grandfather was a deacon. And that neighborhood then, right there, 1118 8th Street, it was a neighborhood. People lived around there. People lived around the church. Mm-hmm. And as a kid, I remember one day, see, the Sabbathany Church, the original Sabbathany, as the other guest was saying, was actually around the corner from Bethesda, downtown, a couple of blocks away. Mm-hmm. And I remember one Sunday, the Sabbathany Church burned down. Mm-hmm. And then maybe a year or so, and I'm not too clear on which burned first, but then the Bethesda Church burned down.
So you're saying two churches burned down in the same area, but within
the same area. And as I grew up, I began to wonder, was this coincidence, or was this at that time frame in the 60s, two churches burned down? And so what Bethesda did is, when the church, we had service at the church, I'll never forget it, at the burning church right outside. They sang and it was really powerful. But they had to move the church to the Pillsbury Community Center, mm-hmm. which was on 7 corners. And a lot of people lived around there. You could walk through there. I mean, people lived in those areas there. Eventually, Bethesda, they were going to build a new church, but what they did was they built the recreation center behind it. That was supposed to be a recreation center. And then the church actually moved into the recreation center. They never built another regular church as they planned on front of it. And so they still have church today. They're still in that location right there, 1118 8th Street South. I drop through there every now and then, and it's really something to go in there and see some of the people I grew up with as a kid still sitting in their same chair. When I go in there, that's where they sit. On that area, that was their area. And there was really, the main churches were, you know, the Bethesda, Sabbathany, and St. Paul, Pilgrim. Over north, you had Zion. And those seemed to be the main churches that I used to visit. I mean, they would come to our church, we would go to their church. And I think it really gets back to the Black communities, how when they came up to areas, they kept their same ways, the things that they did down south. They had the same type of customs, the same type of things. They all, when they came up here, they looked for a church, the very first thing, because they knew they would find people in their community or were like-minded with them. Coming from where, you know, my grandfather, grandmother from Talladega, Alabama, the stories they would tell me about it. I mean, they came up here, you couldn't buy a house down there. You couldn't own any property. You couldn't, I used to ask him, he had an old guitar, and I'd ask him why some of the old Southern blues people only played acoustic guitars. He said, we didn't have no electricity. We,
Sorry.
we didn't have no running water. We didn't have no bell. We had an outhouse. It makes you think, at least it makes me think about the mindset of the people that left there to come up north for you know, better way of life. And the Black businesses, as we've talked about, I mean, it was a monumental thing when Mr. Cassius got a bar downtown Minneapolis.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that was just unbelievable. He was quite the businessman. And he's originally from St. Paul. He went to mechanic arts, which I didn't know that. Graduated from mechanic arts. He was a great businessman. They put together their club, the Nakarima, right in the neighborhood, private club. And we really had, as I was growing up, we had a routine, especially on Sundays. After church, during the summertime, you'd go to Lake Calhoun. And you'd go there and hang out at the main beach, and people from St. Paul, South Minneapolis, North Minneapolis would all be there. I mean, there'd be bikers, there'd be, you name it. And after that, they would go to the Nakarima. And it was standing room only to get in there on those Sundays. So we had, I think, outlets that kept everything safer in the community. I never was afraid in the community, even when we first lived, like I was saying, down Franklin Avenue and 15th Avenue, before moving to 46th and 3rd Avenue, probably in 1963. And that was a huge deal. We were only a few Black people in that neighborhood, and changing schools to go to Ramsey, because I could walk down 47th Street and go. And eventually when the freeway came, we were so used to walking that way, we would climb over the fence and still go across the freeway until we got used to either going up to 50th or going to 42nd Street and going around. But I think what gets overlooked really is, again, is the spirit of the people that came up to the Twin Cities, because you come up through these brutal winters. I mean, the house we lived in at 1309 East 23rd Street, never forget, a man had to bring a big thing of oil to put in this oil tank in the back. And sometimes that thing would run dry. And I mean, I just remember being cold a lot. But also going to this oil can, and they would actually have me, as I was probably 4 or 5 years old, getting this oil, putting it in the furnace and lighting it. I'd never let a kid do anything like that, but that's the conditions that we lived in, brutal winters. And it just shows the resolve to me of the people that came up here to make a way, as my grandmother would say, make a way when there wasn't no way. And then they moved to 39th and 3rd Avenue, probably in the middle 50s. And I used to ride my bike around there, and there was no freeway. So I knew the people across the street, and all those people were gone when the freeway came. Everything was cleared out between 2nd Avenue and Stevens. And a lot of people lived there all the way till you get downtown. It was almost a long, long neighborhood, and it stretched, eventually pretty much stopped at 38th Street for a while. And then people started trickling farther south. And the businesses, again, we've said, and in this little book here, this is another book that Dad wanted to do in 1975. And the man on the cover is a man named John Mitchell, who's really, he's revered in Golden Valley. They actually have a historical society in Golden Valley. When I showed them this, they have a big picture of Mr. Mitchell there. But in this little book, you'll see 17, 18 Black businesses that shows that the community was still thriving, but it, after freeways and the demise of the business, things just seemed to really dissipate. And then when Central High School closed,
No.
I think that was just because the people that worked there,
Mhm.
it was a whole community type of a thing. My sister, I'll just end here. My sister, she went to Washburn, and she was going as a ninth grader. They told her, no, she was going to Ramsey. And they said, well, no, they got a program down at Central. You better go down there. So she goes down to Central. She's on the magnet program. So she skips the ninth grade. She goes from 8th grade down to Central. She ends up graduating from Central, becoming a master's degree at Harvard, a PhD at Columbia, because these people pushed her along, because the staff pushed her along. And it's so strange that there was a lady that worked there, Miss Jones. And Miss Jones's son is the artist Say Two. Now, Miss Jones grew up and graduated from DuSable High School with my dad in Chicago. They're lifelong friends. But she also worked at the school. And there were people that lived in the neighborhood that embraced that school to watch the kids, to tell you what's going on, and to keep you in line and provide you with opportunities. And again, even getting back to freeways, it took a lot of the community out that they said, well, we didn't need this school anymore.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what happened. It was a sad thing. And but again, when I look at Dad's work in the books, I can see that this community was very vibrant. And I do commend those folks in St. Paul, Mr. Anderson and that group that have really put the Rondo situation on the map. But I really do think Minneapolis has been overlooked because it wasn't as concise a community as in St. Paul. It stretched out a lot further in South Minneapolis. So again, the people that are displaced, at that time you had your redlining. You couldn't get a mortgage. So finding new housing was a daunting task in itself for those that got displaced. I don't know how much home ownership there was among the people displaced, but I think that had quite an impact also.
Thank you so much for that. Mr. Moore?
Well, as far as the churches are concerned, Fourth Avenue really was the hub for most of the Black churches in Minneapolis. I know my family attended the St. Thomas Episcopal Church, which is on the corner of 44th and 4th. So it was, a block and a half, 2 blocks from the house. My wife and I got married at St. Thomas Church. Father Lewis Johnson was there, very popular, very well known in the city for not just being a pastor of that church, but for being a person in the community and doing a lot of community work. But yeah, Fourth Avenue was kind of the hub of the community here in Minneapolis, in South Minneapolis, for the African-American community. When I was going to Central, if you had a car, you drove down Fourth Avenue because you didn't want to be missed. If you wanted to hang out someplace after school, as Nelda said, you went to the Schofield's drugstore and hung out at the fountain. And Nelda, that I guess it was a drugstore down on, was it 35th and 4th? Was he a drugstore or a grocery store?
There was a grocery store at
Grocery store.
35th and 4th.
But he also had a fountain.
You're right.
Because I remember when we went to Central, you know, kids would go over there and hang out and have your little 10-cent Coke or whatever. And so we spent a lot of time on that street. The business and how the churches got affected, you know, a lot of people came from the east and the north and the south to go to the churches on 4th Avenue. I don't know a whole bunch of people coming from the west. So I don't know that the interstate had any kind of real impact on people getting to the churches. Business-wise, I remember all of the businesses on 4th Avenue. My favorite barber shop was up there. My favorite record store was up there. There were just a whole lot of very diverse businesses, and it made it interesting to just go up there and just hang out. It was our neighborhood. It was our area. Used to go into the spokesman. My family had a real connection with the spokesman because they knew the owner. My father knew the gentleman who originally started the spokesman. And so we had a lot of connections with them. Then you get to a Central High School. When I was at Central from 1957, I think it was to 1960, it was interesting to see when school let out because all the black kids came out on the east side and all the white kids went out on the west side.
Yeah.
Because most of the white kids lived west of Nicollet Avenue. But it was remarkable how well we all got along. I mean, we really got along very, very well. Central had some great athletic teams, of which I was a part of, football, track and field, basketball. I even played hockey. I was one of the first 3 blacks to play hockey in the city of Minneapolis in 1959, no, 58. Organized high school hockey. But, you know, all the white kids were supportive. We all played football together. We all played basketball together. We all had each other's backs. Minneapolis Central's track team was state champion all 3 years I was in high school. People would see us coming to a track meet and be, oh my goodness, I guess we're not going to win this one because we would just clean house. There were a lot of opportunities for folks in the community to really be able to communicate with each other. You know, we had Nicollet Field, junior high school. I played football down there, but there were a lot of social events down there where a lot of the kids got together on a regular basis. The parents even came and got together on a regular basis. And I'm talking about both black and white parents. So that turned out to be a good opportunity. I spent 14 years coaching football at Nicollet Field when it was, and after it was changed to King Park. And a good portion of the kids, black kids on the team, came from the east side of the freeway, and most of the white kids came from the west side of the freeway. But those kids intermingled, really enjoyed each other's company. Remember one year we even took a group up north to a lake. We had a friend who owned a cabin or a couple of cabins and a lodge on a lake. And she needed a cabin torn down, an old cabin that was falling down. And I said, I'll tell you what, I'll bring my junior high school football team up there and they'll tear it down for you in probably a half hour. And so we actually arranged to get a bus and a couple of vans and took these kids up there for a weekend. We gave them hammers and axes and other things. They tore that cabin down in 5 minutes and had more fun than you've ever seen in your life. And these were black kids and white kids. And they were still talking about it years after that situation happened. I would see some of these kids when they were in high school or after they got out. And the first thing that came out of their mouths, do you remember we went up to, I think it was called Fox Lake, I think it was, no, Lake Adney. You remember we tore that cabin down and all the fun we had, and we camped and we cooked and we fished, and that was the kind of camaraderie that the community had. Even when I played football, we had the same camaraderie. So the community was still pretty well attached to one another, even after the freeway. I remember, you know, just like Anthony, when you had to go someplace on the west side, you just climbed the fence and went down in the gully and went across and came back to the other side. Kids were brave. They didn't care. You know, it's actually fun. But it was always that, you know, it was at the dividing line in the community. I mean, it was just there. And when they finally finished it, I remember going over and looking at it and saw all this concrete going down the road. And I remember seeing a picture of one of the first 2 or 3 days that the freeway was actually open. And there were 3 cars on it. And I'm thinking, wow, 3 cars on a wide open concrete interstate in the state of Minnesota. And now look at it. Totally different. Totally and completely different. And probably not even big enough to handle the traffic we have out there now, in spite of all the modifications they just made. So, you know, it was a good time. It was really a good time. And, you know, you play with all the kids in the neighborhood, and the kids would come to your house, you go to their house, parents would feed each other's kids. And it was just a good time. And the freeway definitely had an impact on it because it took away a lot of those kids that were on the west side of the road. And then
White kids you're talking
it
about,
created
right?
noise. Pardon me?
The white kid you are referring to?
I'm
The
sorry. I didn't
white,
hear you.
the white kids?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, we actually, it was kind of remarkable that we would have that kind of friendship, but that was, you know, that was just the way it was. You know, with the white kid that I lived on the block with down the block, we did everything together, you know, until his parents moved to the suburbs. There wasn't any issue about race that I was really aware of. I wasn't looking for it, but I didn't really ever get called names or anything of that nature. But, you know, as time went by, that started to change. But, you know, 4th Avenue was a corridor. 4th Avenue was a street. You know, Rondo was a street in St. Paul. 4th Avenue was a street in Minneapolis.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for that, Ms. Moore. Ms. Huggins, my next question is, were your parents aware or were told by government officials that 35W were coming through the South Side? And secondly, how did they know the freeway was coming through anyway?
You know, I'm not really aware of there being any kind of official announcement. It almost seemed like it was like a rumor that was passed. And primarily, I think the place that they found out about this was actually the church.
Mm.
You know, because people heard that this was going to happen. There was essentially a sense of disbelief. Oh, they can't do this. You know, this is a vital neighborhood. What are they going to, and then as it started to happen, it was almost like that was when we became more aware of what this was.
Hey, Nelda, can you unmute yourself? I'm sorry, yep, there you go.
There you go.
This says mute here.
Yep, you're good.
fine.
We can
You're
hear
fine.
you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know how that happened, but
It's all right. It's all right.
so like I said, I don't know if there was any kind of official announcement, if there was anything that came by that, you know, telling people, well, this is what's going to happen to your neighborhood. There didn't seem to be extended the respect to let people know what was going to happen. That was just my perception at the time. And I know I did hear expressions of anger when it's finally sunk in what was really going to happen. Because I think everybody realized the destruction of that community and what it would mean to us.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Mr. Scott?
Yes, I definitely agree with Ms. Gaither. I mean, it's like that thing was just pretty much dropped on us. We could see what was beginning to happen with putting up fences, and the next thing you knew, all these houses are gone, and there really was no warning that I'm aware of. I don't know that or think my parents knew much about it, that this was gonna actually happen. Um, and that issue of not engaging the community, I think
Right.
that's a real, I mean, a real act of disrespect. I mean, they could work with the community, say this is what we're going to do, and have an orderly transition, but it didn't seem to really happen that way. All those houses were just gone, and a lot of people lived on Stevens and Second Avenue, going through
Mhm.
South
That's
Minneapolis.
true.
Like I said, and the difficulties of getting a mortgage, or going into another home with the banks, the redlining, and I'd really like to know, maybe even do some research on how many people really own their homes at that time. I don't know what home ownership was in the 50s and 60s. I know that the houses that we have in our family were contracts for deed, and they were just paying someone until they finished paying, and that's it. And in the house we moved to on 46th and 3rd Avenue, there was a situation where my mother and father weren't together, and my mom was paying this lady $90 a month for the house. It was some contract. And so one day a guy calls me from Boston. He says that he's the landlord's son, and you guys were supposed to be out 3 years ago. The contract is up. You got 30 days to come up with X amount of money. And we were like, well, I mean, we've been paying the whole time. And he was like, no, you guys got to go in 30 days. So I knew that my grandmother, who was a domestic, she worked for a person that was a lawyer. And I had met them, and I had been to their house. I had gone there several times. And so I went downtown to look for them. And I had to go up on the 50th floor of the First National Bank building. And it was, I'd never seen where you could see St. Paul from Minneapolis at that view that they had. And they said, well, do you know Mr. John? I said, yeah, my grandmother worked for him. He said, well, when you get home, we'll call him, we'll call you back. And they called me back before I got home. And they said, come back downtown. And they fixed a mortgage or something so that we could keep the house. So I can imagine the people that had been displaced would imagine that they were given so much time. And if you couldn't find a place, if you knock on doors, you can't get here, you can't get there, you were really in a quandary. I don't know if you go back down south, if you go, so that disruption part, I think, of the uprooting people is a whole other thing. When you especially look at the people themselves, what they had to go through that displacement.
Thank you so much. Mr. Moore?
Well, just like everyone else, I don't think there was a whole lot of notification. I do remember some conversations with some of my parents' friends. They would come over, socialize, play cards or something, and the conversation would come up about the freeway coming through. I think when they went to social events, they probably would have an opportunity to talk to people who lived in the neighborhood, and they would all sit around and reflect on the issue. As far as notification in the neighborhood, there really wasn't a whole lot. I know there were a couple of meetings, because I think my father was going to go to one of them. where they were going to present their idea or present what they were going to do. It wasn't an idea at that point. They were basically laying out what they were going to do and when they were going to do it, and not really giving anybody any options. I know there were some people in the neighborhood who called the state government, called the governor's office, called their legislators, trying to get some sort of power to have control over this issue. But during that period of time, legislators were not interested in hearing anything from people of color, no matter what the issue was.
Mm.
So a lot of people, as previously mentioned, were just caught off guard. With Rondo and St. Paul, basically, the feds just decided to come through and do it. And I'm sure that was part of the decision here in Minneapolis as well. They thought about Lindale, they thought about some other options, and the white population over there was not going to let that happen. So they were going to come through where they thought was be the least resistance. And that was, closer to our neighborhood and obviously the Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul. But it did leave a lot of people hanging. Some people were able to spend money and move their house. I remember houses being put up on great big trailers and hauled out of the neighborhood, which of course, at my age, I found to be very fascinating. But most people just lost their property. And as previously mentioned, yeah, you couldn't buy a house because you couldn't go down to Twin City Federal or some of these other banks and get a mortgage. And unfortunately, I think that's even true today. But there just wasn't no opportunity for these folks to be able to move and get themselves set up all over again. And I'm sure there were other neighborhoods that weren't particularly interested in having people of color move into their neighborhood.
Mm.
So there's a whole lot of issues around this, and I don't think we'll ever know exactly what it was, but I think probably the criteria followed for Rondo was the criteria for South Minneapolis. And most people, I would think, who lived during that period of time would have the same opinion. And I think, the people who live in the community today, if there was to be some sort of construction issue in the community or some sort of infrastructure done, whether it's roads or something else, they're a lot more politically astute. Both the Black and the white members of our community are a lot more astute and would be more willing to come forward and challenge authorities on the decisions they're making and how they're making them, and making sure that they're included in that process. Because back then we were not included in the process.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. With the few minutes you have left, I want to ask this particular question to you briefly. What are your thoughts on undoing the harm caused by freeway construction? You have any thoughts about that? Any one of you?
I guess I can say
Go ahead.
something that I don't know how you undo that type of harm. I really don't. I mean, I think that when you look at the people and what they did, it was made by their hands. It was made by their effort. I mean, they came up here to really establish themselves. And I see in St. Paul, which, Mr. Anderson, the folks over there have done a real good job of commemorating the Rondo business
Yes,
district.
they are. Yes.
But they've now talked about a land bridge across the freeway that's supposed to be housing and businesses. And I have no idea. I haven't seen the concept. I haven't seen how something like that would work, but I don't think you bring those things back. I mean, I think what the freeways do is it takes away so much of the surrounding area that it really leaves a big void in schools, access to hospitals, access to services that I don't know how it comes back to a Rondo that we knew, or a Golden, or a Highway 55, which is a business corridor in North Minneapolis,
yeah.
Plymouth Avenue, which was a business corridor in Plymouth. on Plymouth Avenue. So I guess that's a question that I'm pretty much perplexed how you would make that better. Housing is not affordable for people now. Uh, Home ownership is really with not within reach of a lot of people, especially people of color. Um, so unless there's some type of massive undertaking with employment, that's one of the other things with a lot of the people coming up from the South. There was employment, and you could do things to get yourself started by renting a room somewhere. Maybe you rent a room, start getting a job. Maybe you bring your family. And if all of those things just don't exist where people can really get started. So not to be a doom and gloom type person,
Mm-hmm.
but I drive through Franklin Avenue. I drive around 4th Street. I drive where O'Toole's drug was on 38th and 4th Avenue. And my grandmother would send Mr. O'Toole a note, and he would give me her diabetic medicine. I mean, who would do that to a kid today? Who would just let you go in with a note? And so you lose the spirit to me, of the community, the kind of pull together thing. And as even Mr. Moore said, coming up, I played sports, and then when we moved south to Washburn, I was one of the only one or two people on the football and track teams, or black people on those teams. And it was different because where I came from down at Phillips and Adams, I mean, black quarterbacks, running backs, everything. It wasn't anything that I thought was out of the normal for us to do anything. So I would like to really hear people's suggestions and how you undo something uh, like this that's not only happened here but around the country.
Okay.
I think most of the people who were impacted by the freeway technically are gone. That history needs to be continuously brought forth so people understand what took place during that period of time. And as I mentioned before, you have young people today that wouldn't let that happen without questioning, without challenging. Back then it was totally different. I mean, Black folks were progressive, but they weren't progressive to the point where they were going to challenge government, whether it's state, local, federal. And
Lack of power.
yeah, and you struggle so hard to maintain what you had, whether it's a house or a job or whatever you had, that a lot of folks weren't going to put themselves up on that pedestal to be the yay rah person. We need to stop this like they do today, because back then, when you would, and I mentioned this before to the group, when you go downtown Minneapolis, you'd be walking down the sidewalk and you look around and you're probably the only Black person on that side of the street. And you look on the other side of the street and you see a Black person and you're like, hey, how you doing? You don't even know who it is. You're just happy to see them. And that was the environment, that was the atmosphere then. And so people, they were apprehensive about challenging the authority, if you want to say. But I don't think that would happen today. But we need to make sure that people get involved in what we're doing right now by presenting this history and letting them be well aware of what went on back during that period of time.
Thank you so much. I think we're about out of time. Am I right, Ms. Gay there?
No, I was actually going to open it to Q&A.
Are
we losing Anthony?
Please.
No, are we losing Ernest?
I'm sorry, what, Mr. Moore?
Am I losing all of you?
No, you're
No,
not.
we're still here.
You're good. It's just Q&A time now.
Yes. Someone asked by Anna Abrams, were there programs for compensation or assistance to address displacement? If so, were they functional?
Would like to answer that.
I think if you owned your home, obviously they'd have to make some type of deal with you. And I think part of it was the amount of time they would give you to when you had to move. Because I've heard stories of people that, I need more time. I can't find a place. And I
Yeah.
can't move
We
within the
losing
time
anything?
that you've given. So I mean, I guess that would be my comment to that.
I'm sure that there had to have been compensation for people that owned their property. And, this issue of finding a new place to live, it keeps coming up because my parents elected, because the neighborhood had changed so substantially by 1968 that my father just said, we're going to move, because it had declined so much. The culture was gone. The sense of community was gone. And they ended up buying a house on 48th and 2nd. And at that point, it was right on the freeway. This was in 1968. And initially, they had to have the realtors really fight for them for them to be able to get that home. They had the money, they had a connection with legal connection through my father's employer, and it still took a movement for them to be able to buy that house on 48th and 2nd. When I moved in 78, and I was moving to the east side of Chicago Avenue, my block had no people of color. And my dad referred me to the same husband and wife couple of realtors, and I had to fight in order to buy this house. I've been here now for 42 years, but it took a lot of effort. And I can't imagine what it must have been like back in the mid 60s when you just did not have the backing of the community, if you didn't have the connections, if you didn't have the legal, legal authority to do these things. It had to have been just absolutely devastating. So even if you owned your home, and many people did, you had no options.
I moved in my house in 1965. And the neighborhood on 44th and Columbus was really upset because we were the first Black couple to move in on the block, still in the house.
Mm-hmm.
And if it hadn't been for the two little old ladies who lived in the house, they were two sisters, they were twins, and they wanted to go to Florida. They wanted to retire and go to Florida. And when Liz and I and the baby came in the house, they immediately latched onto us. They would be carrying my daughter around, playing with her, having a wonderful time. She was about 13, 14 months old. So one Sunday after 5 visits, because the realtor told me, oh, we're going to find you a nice property north of 38th Street, which meant that, he wasn't going to sell me anything south of 38th Street.
Mm-hmm.
But after the 4th or 5th visit, one of the older ladies spoke up and said, if you don't sell the house to this nice young couple, you're fired. We got a phone call that following Monday. Sat down, Tuesday or Wednesday, or no, Thursday, signed the papers, and that was it. He wasn't about to lose the money, I guess, but the neighbors were not happy. And guess what? I didn't care.
Another question, Ms. Gaither?
Yes, we just had another question come in by John Crippen, director of Hennepin History Museum. Thinking about Nelda's parents moving just 10 blocks south, why was it a better neighborhood, even though it was still next to 35W? Is the closer proximity to 94 and 35 part of the issue?
No, I don't believe so. I think the problem occurred, and my mother never found out what the reason was. But my dad came home from work. He would typically work until 8 or 9 o'clock on his job. And he came home one night and he just said, "Nellie, we're moving." He had apparently seen something had upset him on his drive home in the neighborhood, and he wanted to get out. I think the significant thing was that the neighborhood had just changed. The 10 blocks south seemed to have made a difference. And again, like Louis mentioned, it just something about the destruction, both the environmental destruction as well as the cultural destruction that had happened in that neighborhood. And I'll describe it as the central neighborhood, because I think Central was probably like the main connection that many people had. But there was just such a tremendous destruction of so much, both tangible and intangible, that moving 10 blocks made a difference.
Mr. Scott, you got something to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's was some of the mindset of our ancestors and people before us that came up, that whatever obstacle they had, whatever, they seemed to find a way. They seemed to have some resilience. And I know when we moved to 46th and 3rd Avenue, like I say, 1962 or 3, just before the freeway was coming, being one of the few blacks at Ramsey and the few blacks at Washburn, but I got to know a lot of people in my neighborhood. Like my good friends were Dr. Johnson's kids.
Oh, yeah.
Judge Poston lived across the street on Portland. Matter of fact, Judge Poston married my cousin in his chambers. I was the best man. But these were our neighbors. We all, when you got to 46th Street, or you got south of 42nd, or certainly south of 38th, or south of 42nd Street even, it was just, it was an adjustment for me, coming into an area where I was now the only black in certain areas. And it took a while to meet new friends, but this was done by the family to better our lot in life. They felt that going out to the better neighborhoods, better schools, better. So that was the big change. It was a big change coming out there. But our family still own those houses in South Minneapolis, brothers and sisters live in them. And but it's, again, the things that are around them. With the park even seems different at Nicollet. I remember going there and playing football games and baseball games, and with the freeway behind it, and it just seems kind of an unspoken barrier. And maybe it relates to this mindset called the caste system, where we as black people almost have to always look over our shoulder. Here we're going into an area where we don't know anybody. They're mainly white. We have to really be, I guess, vigilant on what's going on in this area. Are we going to be welcomed here? Are we going to be comfortable here? And fortunately for me, moving out there, I've made a lot of friends, played football and sports with all the kids out there. And it seemed to grow as my sisters and brothers went to school out there. More people came, and it became more of a normative thing. I think until the prices started going up, then everybody was kind of locked out again.
Mhm.
Thank you.
We had 2 more questions come in, one from Sarah, and maybe Dr. Lloyd, you might be able to answer this question because I know you worked for the highway department. how was it decided where the freeway was going? My grandparents lived on 43rd and 2nd. Why were they spared? They were Black. And then we have another question by Anna. Anna Abrams. Was there a predominant area where displaced families went?
And you want to answer first?
I was gonna say, do you happen to know that?
Oh.
Yes.
Traditionally, let me start with history. Highway was built traditionally, an area less resistant, with area where people like political power, like economic might, and they were traditionally people of color or poor people. We could not find any record from all of our research with human toll indicating that the highway was deliberately put here for a particular reason. It was just put here. And I think Dr. D'Onofrio is on the line too. He may add more to my response. But we could not find that so-called smoking gun to say we planners and designers and politicians and city officials say in MnDOT, Highway Department people say it's going through this area of South Central Minneapolis. No, we couldn't find that as a smoking gun, if you will. Dr. D'Onofrio?
The only thing I would add to Dr. Lloyd's assessment is that the location of red lines that were associated with redlining maps made in the 1930s talked about and suggested the need for a division between neighborhoods that were coded differently in terms of investment grades. And we have no knowledge that highway planners were looking at redlining maps, but the evidence lines up in that direction that they had an influence on freeway planners.
And then I guess for the second question, was there a predominant area where displaced families went?
To my recollection, no. It seemed like people just scattered to the wind. A lot of folks they felt like if they moved to the suburbs, if they could find one where they'd have to fight to get into many of them. But if they just left, they would find another place where this wouldn't happen because it was very traumatic. A lot of my friends, their families just moved out of Minneapolis. They left the state, had friends that moved. For example, 2 families that I know just moved back to St. Louis. It was something they were familiar with. They knew the terrain. They knew what they were going to have to deal with there. They just pretty much gave up. And like I said, it was like people just scattered to the wind. The only time that we connected was when we went to I think it was our 30th high school reunion. And then we started to hear, well, where did you go? Where did you go? And it seemed like very few people actually had remained here in the city, white and Black.
We do know where all the homes went, Ms. Gaither. From 30, we do know where the home went, but we don't know what happened to the people, where they go.
That's right.
That becomes another continuing cycle for the Human Toll Project. Where did the people go? Just like Ms. Huggins say, it's almost like from our standpoint too, good point. That's a good analogy. They just scatter in the wind, so to speak. It's a very sad set of affairs.
Yeah.
I think I might have missed a question previously by Arlene Robinson. What year did 35W come through the neighborhood? I know following the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, that's when we started seeing a lot of just these cities across the country kind of design the interstate pretty much. But do you know exactly when kind of the conversations started happening within Minneapolis about 35W? Because I think it was completed in 1965.
Seven.
Okay.
Mhm.
1957, yeah.
And it started building it soon as the DOT, the highway department began to purchase property, demolish building, tear over bulldoze trees and what have you. And the goal was to get it built as soon as possible. So they started that project in the 1960s, early 60s, and completed that section in 1967.
Okay. Thank you.
And I think the question earlier from the person that was asking why did their house stay? I think, did you say she lived on 43rd or 42nd and 2nd Avenue?
On 43rd and 2nd, yes.
43rd and 2nd. And all I can say about that is they lived on the right side of the street. Because they lived on the odd side of the street. Everybody's house across the street were gone. They took all of those houses to make the freeway up and down the freeway. And as far as where did they go, as Mr. Moore said, several houses were actually moved farther south Minneapolis. And my father-in-law, who was a contractor, he actually moved several houses into South Minneapolis that were right around the area of 24th, 25th, and 4th Avenue, which was another vibrant type of community from Franklin to about 26th to 28th. I mean, you had a couple of drugstores there. Matter of fact, the former mayor, R.T. Ryback's dad, was a pharmacist on like 26th and 4th Avenue, right on the corner, even though the name was pronounced differently then. But I also had some friends that went to an enclave in Bloomington. They moved out to Bloomington, and I think people probably had a better chance by being a one-off, 2 people, 3. I think when you start saying, oh, there's 4 or 5 people, I think the panic tends to set in. But as Ms. Gaither said earlier, people really just had to go for themselves, and they were used to that. I mean, for the most part, they had come from an area where they were marginalized to the teeth. So they knew it was going to take more to continue to have housing and provide for their families.
We just have a message from Greg D'Onofrio, who was a project member for Human Toll. And he said one of the surprising findings of the Human Toll research is that 50% of the houses between Lake Street and Highway 62 were moved to other locations. If moved to other locations in Minneapolis, we know where the houses went. And you can see a larger map of this in the exhibit. And he also mentioned, we have no idea where people went, such as the nature of administrative record keeping at that time. Property was carefully tracked. However, people were not. Yep. I think we.
But look, may I say something real quick here? What Dr. D'Onofrio is saying so profoundly is that it goes to show you the nature and the power of the interstate highway system at that time. That I will argue we are not careful today with the new infrastructure bill. History have a tendency to repeat itself. That's why what you are saying, Mr. Scott, we need to be visual. We need to have our hand on whatever mechanism we need to have our hands on to ensure that it doesn't take place again.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, though, it is taking place even today. There was a recent construction of interstate expansion in South Carolina.
Exactly.
They went through the black neighborhood and just told folks to get out, tore down the houses, built it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Moore. You're exactly right about that.
Yeah.
We have to be very, very careful all the time.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for spending this evening with us and listening to all of our speakers. This has been really engaging. I know for myself. And I just want to thank our panelists. And I would also encourage everybody to take some time to come to Hennepin History Museum. A Human Toll, a public history of 35W is going to be on exhibit until October of 2022. So you all have at least 10 more months to come visit us at the museum. And we are actually free admission till the end of the year this year. So please, please come. And thank you so much. I hope you all learned something this evening. And yeah, thank you. I hope you have a wonderful night.
Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
It's
Thank
been
you, Ms. Gator.
it's been a wonderful experience. Trust me. It's
And
been
thank
it's
you.
been healing, actually, I would
Yeah.
say.
Oh,
And thank you, Akoma, for organizing.
Yes, thank you.
yes.